For those who don't know me, my name is Fritz Steiner, and I have the honor of being Dean and Paley Professor here at the Weitzman School. I'm a three-time graduate of the school, so I'm really proud of the contributions our faculty, students, and alums make to the built environment and to related professions. In fact, since the university was founded, the Penn community has a shared commitment to doing good in the world. In the words of that consummate pragmatist Ben Franklin, the goal of education can be summarized. I'll quote from Ben here. I feel like I know Ben well enough to call him Ben and not Mr. Franklin. That's a real UVA thing. And UVA, everything is Mr. Jefferson this, Mr. Jefferson that. I think Ben was just more down to earth. Okay, I won't get into it. But, so Ben, this is a quote from Ben. He said, an inclination joined with the ability to serve mankind, of course today we would say humankind, one's country, friends, and family. So though it's changed over the past 3 centuries, Penn has grown and diversified, including new schools and degrees, but that commitment that Franklin made at the very beginning of the establishment of the University of Pennsylvania to do good in the world and to serve others remains. This fall, we've introduced a new strategic framework for our school that helps to formalize that commitment. It articulates, this is kind of funny, especially for architects. We began by calling them pillars, and then we called them 4 foundations, and now we're calling them 4 cornerstones. So we're trying to figure out the right part of the building to, I like foundations, but then I realized you can't have more than 1 foundation. You can't have 4 foundations. And pillars had its own, so anyway, we're calling them cornerstones, and maybe you can suggest something better to call them. But it's going to be architectural, I think. I think we've gone down that road. But anyway, we have 4 cornerstones that guide our research, teaching, and community engagement. First, we're about designing healthier, safer, and more accessible cities, neighborhoods, buildings, and public spaces. Second, we're about promoting excellence and interdisciplinary innovation in the arts and the built environment professions. 3, we're about advancing climate solutions, energy efficiency, and environmentally sensitive design. And 4th, we're about strengthening communities through cultural exchange, heritage conservation, and public engagement. And tonight's gathering and program exemplifies 2 of those cornerstones, designing healthier, safer, more accessible cities, and promoting interdisciplinary innovation. Our panelists come from architecture, planning, real estate development and finance, and journalism. And credit for this range of expertise goes out to organizer Hina Jamelle. Hina is the genius that pulled these folks together. So she's an architect and an associate professor of practice in the Department of Architecture and co-founder of Contemporary Architecture Practice, which is based in New York City and Shanghai. She's been the department's director of urban housing for 12 years, curated an exhibition of our graduate architecture students' work during this past year's Venice Biennale. She also has convened a conference on urban housing here since 2016, which led to a book of essays and design studies in 2021. It's important it is an important analysis of the pressures affecting urban housing. They work at different scales, from the global economy to cities, industry, buildings, and individuals, but we can influence them. Her book also exemplifies how deeply the architecture department has been invested in ideas alongside design. Adaptive reuse emerges as an essential part of our response to the housing affordability crisis. And since Hina's book, that situation has just gotten worse, unfortunately. In the wake of the COVID pandemic, the focus on adaptive reuse has taken on a new urgency. Historically, cities have been essential to increasing sustainability and equity, but we're now facing new threats. The rise of remote and hybrid work has contributed to vacancy rates in office buildings across the country that we really haven't seen in this country since the Great Recession. Companies of all sizes have reduced their physical footprints, and older, less centrally located buildings have been hit hardest. Adaptive reuse is vital in helping once thriving urban cores to come alive again. And I'll go off script just a little bit for a moment. I've just returned. It seems like I've still got a little bit of jet lag. I just returned from Shanghai, and it's very interesting to me to see the challenges after 20 years of visiting China, the challenges that the real estate market is facing in China at the moment is sadly familiar to us in the United States. But it's prompting much the same thing response that Hina has suggested with her focus on adaptive reuse. The Chinese government is refocusing on existing urban areas and adaptive reuse. So, although I wrote these comments mainly from an American perspective, I would also observe that the issue goes way beyond the United States. The exhibition this past year in Venice showcases design studies that were created here in the fall of 2024 in response to the Biennale's call for climate solutions. For the duration of a semester, second year Master of Architecture studios focused on repurposing commercial office space as residential units. The work chosen to be highlighted highlighted the role of architects, what they can play in creating a more sustainable and equitable future, which brings us back to the school's strategic goals. One of the things you'll observe in the work coming out of our urban housing studios is the development of public spaces in conjunction with urban housing. When we link housing to other programs and conditions, that's when we really live up to our professional responsibilities of protecting public health, safety, and welfare. So I want to congratulate all the Architecture 601 students for their contribution to this important topic, and to the faculty who led the studies, Scott Erdy, Brian Phillips, Simon Kim, Ben Crone, and Richard Garber. And if you haven't already, please explore the design studies that surround us. So I'm looking forward to the panel, and it's my great pleasure now to turn it over to Hina Jamelle.
Let's see. Forward is, let me see. How do we go on this? Okay. Well, hello. Yeah. Well, thank you, Fritz, for that very nice introduction. Yeah, it has to go a little bit lower. So, yes, I am, and I'm very glad that we're participating in the pillars of the school and strengthening it on our part in the architecture department. For sure, this is something that is important to all and important, like you say, on a global level as well as an American one. And is it working now? Yes, now it's working. Okay. So I'm Hina Jamelle, and I just want to extend a warm welcome to the students, to the faculty, and the guests today. And thank you for being here. I've been asked to say that if this event allows you to get AIA credits, and so after the event, you can sign a form to get those credits as well. I do also want to thank Dean Fritz Steiner and Chair Rosanna Hu for their support for the event for today, and also the architectural program and urban studios in general. And I want to reiterate my thanks to the team, the teaching team, and the urban housing faculty. That is Scott Erdy, Brian Phillips, Richard Garber, Ben Crone, and Simon Kim. And I want to particularly now thank all the panelists who, as soon as I said, look, this is the topic that I'm interested in talking about, so enthusiastically accepted our invitation. I also want to give a public thank you to Brennan Flory, whose help and focus, this event would really not be possible. Thank you, Brennan. And also the exhibition that I'll talk a little bit about that is surrounding you today. So, under pressure. Being under pressure assumes something compelling is at stake. It's to come face to face with urgency. Being under pressure, its deadlines and obligations, part of the package, suggests a call for action in a timely and efficient way. Today, we are here because we realize that pressure has come to bear on certain aspects of the city. In major cities, both housing and office buildings are under pressure. Housing due to affordability, offices due to vacancy. In response to increasing strain on urban resources and providing affordable housing, there's a renewed attention on adaptive reuse, especially the conversion of commercial buildings into housing. Today's multidisciplinary panel examines how architecture can confront the housing crisis through thoughtful transformation of existing structures. With companies largely downsizing their physical footprints, demand for traditional office space has declined, making many older buildings vacant. Featuring the viewpoints of architects, developers, economists, and policy experts, rather than treating vacancy as a loss, Under Pressure 2 positions it as a design opportunity where reuse becomes a tool for shaping more responsive and resilient cities. So that sets up our goal today. And this is a series of 3 charts that I think really says it all. Office vacancies post-COVID are at an all-time high. While some companies have returned to the office, which we're seeing, many have adopted now different ways of working altogether and have adopted hybrid work as a means for that. And when you do have hybrid work, that means companies need less office space. Going forward, despite there is a slight uptick in terms of the return to the office, future AI-based efficiencies, downsizing that we now see that are hitting the headlines in major corporations as well as tech companies, downsizing or even hiring freezes may also result in companies continuing to need less space. Widespread vacancies often exceed 20%. This diagram shows the gap between vacancy rates and the percentage of buildings suitable for residential conversion. Suitability is, what do we mean by suitability? Suitability is defined by varying factors like zoning, building age, size. However, only a small percentage of currently eligible for reuse under their respective jurisdictions, which determine eligibility based on factors such as floor plate depth, window access, structural layout, and importantly, zoning compliance. Cities like Washington and Chicago demonstrate the strongest potential for impactful conversion programs, where high vacancies aligns with relatively large pool of adapted buildings and supportive policy momentum. Conversely, markets such as Houston and Phoenix expose the limits of one-size-fits-all solutions where vacancies are high, but the building stock typology, floor plate zoning frameworks, and current policies restrict feasibility. Across the United States, the housing deficit continues to widen, with projections showing a shortage of more than 4 million units by 2030. The greatest housing demand is concentrated in cities like Chicago, LA, and New York, places that, interestingly, also lead the nation in office vacancies. Urban location and infrastructure advantages make office to residential conversions particularly effective. Many vacant office buildings are in transit-rich, amenity-heavy neighborhoods, allowing new housing to leverage existing building transportation, utilities, and services, while supporting sustainable, walkable communities. This chart shows the upward trend of commercial to residential conversions. You can just see how striking it is when you hit 24 and 25. So as of 2025, this is the most recent, roughly 81 million square feet of office space across the US is under construction or in planning for residential conversion. Adaptive reuse is emerging as both an environmental and economic imperative. Why? They typically cut total development time by typically up to 2 years and reduce embodied carbon emissions and embodiment by 30%. That's a huge factor and a great advantage for having adaptive reuse. So, this picture and this setup leads us to the question. That's the problem. But what does innovation look like in this context of transforming vacant commercial spaces into housing and in reimagining urban resilience? I'll just show you a few examples that sort of set the stage. The Porterhouse, completed by Sharp Architects in 2003, converted a 6-story 1905 brick warehouse into 22 luxury condominiums by adding a 4-story zinc and glass extension. I don't know if the pointer works. Yeah, a zinc and glass extension into above an existing structure. The project totaled roughly 45,000 square feet, with ground retail activating the street and residential units above, setting one of the earliest precedents for mixed-use adaptive reuse in New York. Rather than masking the addition, which was typically what used to happen before, Sharp emphasized the seam between the old and the new, establishing a precedent for design-forward reuse that influenced later projects across the city, from Soho loft conversions to large mixed-use developments. The 62-meter tall, 17-story structure of the silo in the Netherlands within Copenhagen's Nordhaven district, as grain storage needs declined, Kobe seized the opportunity to imagine the industrial relic into a model of adaptive reuse, preserving its monumental presence while redefining its function for contemporary urban life. Inside, 40 distinct apartments are stacked within the original silo frame, each shaped by the building's varying floor plates and cylindrical geometry. Public spaces on the ground and top floors, in an event hall above and a restaurant below, invite the broader city in, transforming the silo for both a place to live and as a civic destination for Copenhagen. The adaptive reuse approach preserves the original concrete structure while adding a new layer of steel punctuated by carefully organized openings, balconies, and railings. The intervention shapes the interior spaces and enables the building to take on a new role as a residential complex. SOM's design for 1633 Broadway engages an existing structure. This is the existing building, selectively removing and reshaping floor plates to create residential layouts that maximize natural light. Vertical voids and strategic carving transform the monolithic tower into a more open, livable structure. Repurposing the original building saves 50% of embodied carbon, reduces construction time for new construction, and demonstrates how adaptive reuse can be financially viable while addressing urban sustainability goals. This is important that beyond for serving its residents, the Broadway building actively supports surrounding neighborhoods by incorporating community-oriented programs such as grocery stores and schools, converting a once isolated office building into a dense mixed-use hub. The project brings different groups together in one centralized place and is a new center for neighborhood life and everyday interactions. I would argue, though, that the innovation actually lies in the way that the units are configured, because it integrates 327 luxury units, 382 bedroom unit co-living apartments, and 838 micro-affordable units. Innovative technologies like co-living and micro-affordable units, they do increase flexibility and density and provide housing options for diverse residents. It's also a really interesting proposal as far as equitable living, as this proposal distributes high-quality living spaces across all unit types, giving every resident access to natural light, outdoor terraces, and views, and it challenges the conventional stratification of luxury and affordable units. Here it's more equitable. So this is so the graduate urban housing studios at Weitzman, I would say we call them incubators, right? For all these ideas where we can begin to, I mean, that happens throughout all the studios at Weitzman, but in particular for the urban housing ones, we've been really trying to test innovative ideas as to how you can move beyond just a simple retrofit or where you're just maximizing, but how do you really contribute? So the studios for the past 2 years have been focusing on innovative approaches to commercial and residential conversions and the public space that serve both the needs of the community and the residential building through architectural means of spatial organization and design. The value of this approach has been very succinctly said by our very own faculty member, Brian Phillips, and I quote him, "I think part of this failure in America is our inability to link housing to other programs and urban conditions. Instead of using it as a framework to uplift wealth, security, and community, it continues to exist solely as an investment instrument with economic returns as an end to itself." So we're surrounded here by posters where they capture sort of the intentional essence of what we've been doing in the urban housing studios, where we do propose public spaces and its relation to the private residential units as a part of the students' adaptive reuse projects. So earlier this afternoon, 3 of our panelists joined us to really sort of discuss the question of publicness. And this was the question for which you're seeing the answers on the posters around us, which is, what is emerging in designing your spaces of publicness? How do your public spaces serve the needs of the community and your residential building through architectural means of spatial organization and design? So the results of which are around you. I'd encourage you to have a look at them after the talk. But each of them, we have 68 students in our second year studios, and we have 68 different approaches to this very complex problem. Within the studios themselves, we take on some of these issues. Scott Erdy's studio confronts the inherent complexities of the office building typologies, such as deep floor plates, limited natural light, and constrained circulation, through the placement of strategic voids. These reuse strategies of both public and private spaces bring new life into existing structures. Richard Garber's studio takes a modular approach to the housing unit, placement within a deep floor plate. He explores affordability and cost efficiencies of off-site modular unit construction and rethinks their organization within rigid existing building structural grids. Ben Crone's studio explores how architecture can reshape the relationship between public and private life. in dense urban housing. Projects approach adaptive reuse not just as a way to fill empty buildings, but examining how housing units can vary in density and public connections can be rearranged to encourage new forms of social interaction. Unique local neighborhood observations in Brian Phillips' studio provide unique solutions to carving an existing building that includes raising public streets up into the existing commercial building. The resulting unit configurations, such as these, really echo the townhouse organizations that we see in Philadelphia. In my own studio, we really configure interior layouts in innovative ways, intelligently arranging multiple housing types to allow for increase and types as well as sizes to allow increased unit densities, carving into expansive floor plates and reimagining formal and spatial arrangements. We transform previously overlooked buildings into new functional and vibrant spaces. The public connections are also incredibly important, especially to transport hubs that really encourage social interaction and connections to the city. So these projects are currently, as Fritz mentioned, on view till November 2025 at the Venice Architecture Biennale. So their title of their call was, what was that? Yes, Repair, Regenerate, and Reuse, which brings together 207 participants from 52 countries. And so it was very nice that our own studios were able to participate in that conversation. So today, the goal for our panel discussion is to bring together thought leaders who share our interest in looking for best practices and innovation in solutions to urban housing. We will first hear 10-minute presentations of our 5 panelists, and then at the end of the 5, this will be the order that we'll hear them in, and then at the end of the 5, we'll all convene at the front for a panel discussion. So I'm going to keep the introductions to our panelists very brief. They are there on detail at the Weitzman website, but and also we have links on the website as well, but let me introduce Peter Grant. Peter is a senior reporter at the Wall Street Journal, where he covers real estate development and urban trends. His articles are really essential readings on this topic. His recent reporting focuses on adaptive reuse projects, examining how aging office buildings, industrial structures, and retail spaces are being transformed to meet new economic and social demands. Aprit Gupta is at the New York University Stern School of Business. His research interests focus on using large data sets to understand dynamics in household finance, real estate, and corporate finance. Vincent Reyna, our very own professor at the University of Pennsylvania City and Regional Planning. He is the founder and faculty director of the Housing Initiative at Penn. Reyna served as the senior advisor for housing and urban policy in the Biden White House Domestic Policy Council, where he worked to address the nation's housing affordability and supply challenges, increase to housing ownership, and advance equitable development and community investment. Martha Kelly is the managing director at Bain Capital and leads the team's retail and living sectors. Martha was previously the managing director at Goldman Sachs Asset Management and head of Northeast Acquisitions, where she was responsible for originating and executing real estate deals and strategies. Robert Fuller is the Gensler lifestyle sector leader in the firm's New York office that specializes in large complex projects that include planning and urban design, building repositioning, office to residential conversions, and mixed-use developments. And so I think this is the perfect sort of gathering to really take on and look for innovation in some of the solution, not any solution to convert to commercial to residential, but I think innovative ones. So with that, I'd like to welcome Peter to the stage.
Thank you, Hina, and thank you, Weitzman School. I think some of you know that I'm a Penn alum. Class of '76 is a little bit scary to say. So it's been a real treat to come back here and walk up and down Locust Walk. Just to put '76 in context, one of the memories that came back to me was the fact that Ford was running against Carter one day when I was here. That was in '76, the year I graduated. I think it was also the year that Mao died. So gives you some historical perspective. But it was sort of a great time walking down memory lane. All these memories came flooding back to me. I recommend going back to your alma mater when you get on in the years. It's kind of nice thing about aging. It's about the only nice thing about aging I can think of right now. But sort of on the theme of time machines, I think one way that I can add something to this conversation is to try to contextualize what's happening right now in conversions and commercial space in terms of the other commercial downturns that I've covered in my career in journalism. And I say downturns because I'm going to be sort of the tough voice of economic realism, I think, on this panel, because it really is about economics if these projects are going to come together. And downturns provide one of the very necessary ingredients for conversions, which is that the commercial office market is tanking, and you can pick up these buildings at very cheap prices. The conventional use of these buildings isn't there, and landlords and investors and banks are all trying to figure out what to do to either salvage their investments or make money. So the first downturn that I covered was in the early '90s. It was pretty much triggered by the S&L crisis. At that time, commercial real estate, one could argue, was responsible for pulling the entire economy into a recession. It was that bad. It was also probably my favorite downturn of the ones I've covered, just because all the fights among the developers and the creditors percolated to the public view. A lot of these battles were open, they were in bankruptcy, they were in the courts. You might remember there was a developer by the name of Donald Trump who had a few issues during that time. He had a number of his casinos were in bankruptcy. But it was during that time that we saw the first big wave of conversions that I wrote about, and that was primarily in New York City. Keep in mind, I was mostly writing about New York real estate at the time, so I'm not quite sure what was going on in the rest of the country. But in New York, there were a lot of conversions taking place downtown New York. So why did this happen? Well, it had one of the ingredients, which was the fact that the values of these buildings were tanking. It also had another really important ingredient, which comes up over and over again when we're dealing with conversions, and that's public subsidies, public tax breaks, and other public sector participation in these projects. Without that, these projects really don't pencil out as far as I can tell. And so in New York, what was happening at that time was there was particular concern about downtown, because before that recession took place, you had a lot of the downtown Wall Street firms. They weren't Wall Street anymore, because they're all moving to Midtown. So even before the recession, there was a big concern about downtown. Then when you had the recession, the implosion of values, the increase of vacancy, there was a lot more concern. And so the public sector stepped forward and provided a number of tax abatement subsidies, and there was a wave of conversions. It also helped that the downtown building stock was very conducive to conversions. You had a lot of the older pre-war wedding cake design buildings that, especially in the towers, you could convert into apartments. So that happened. There were thousands of units that were produced on the market. But as soon as the economy got better and the office market rebounded, the conversions stopped. I remember back in the early 90s, there was a saying, stay alive till 95, among all the brokers and the landlords, and that turned out to be true. And so by 95, the market was bouncing back. Also, investors like Sam Zell, Merrill Lynch, that bought a lot of the debt, the distressed debt at pennies on the dollar, were making boatloads of money. And so tons of investment flooding back into office. And so that put this wave of conversions at rest, to rest. The next downturn that I'd like to talk about was a global financial crisis. Different ingredients caused that crisis. Probably most of you are old enough to remember it. But it was driven by the implosion of the housing market and the subprime crisis. And partly because of that, partly because it was caused by housing, there were very little conversions back then because nobody wanted to touch housing. It was kryptonite. So even though there were certain ingredients that were conducive to conversions, namely the fact that values were going down, you didn't have some of the others. And so we didn't see the same amount of conversions that we did in the early 90s. And then the market in like 97, like 2000, 2001, I'm sorry, my time frame is wrong. A number of years into that downturn, things began to bounce back because when you think about what was going on back then, you had high unemployment. Employment began to fall, and when employment fell back then, the decline in employment results in increase in demand in office. You also had low interest rates, and the combination of those two things helped the office market roar back again. So boom, we're back to a prosperous office market and very few conversions. Now let's talk about the current downturn that we're in right now. So even before that happened, even before the pandemic hit, the office market was beginning to get shaky because of technology, because of new competitors like WeWork and other co-working firms. Demand for office was beginning to dip. Then the pandemic hit, and it was like it took all these trends that were taking place that were softening the market, it put them on rocket fuel. And changes that probably would have taken years to take place took place in a matter of weeks. And we all know what happened. The return to office was very slow. Working from home got very popular. Hybrid workplace strategies also became popular. And what we have right now, I mean, people were thinking, oh, is it going to be all remote work, or are people going to come back 5 days a week? It's somewhere in between. But the most important thing that's really happened right now is that demand for office space has become disconnected from economic trends, from employment. So we have relatively high employment right now, but demand for office space remains low. Also, unlike the global financial crisis, interest rates are very high. So basically, what I'm sort of saying is the good news here is that the downturn now is not cyclical, it's structural. This is here to stay, and that's good because we're not going to have the economy roar back and all of a sudden office demand will be back and no more conversions. So the need for conversions will still be here. And what we're beginning to see throughout the country, and I think one of the charts showed it, is that the volume of conversions is going up. So that's the good news. The not so good news is that the economics are still struggling. You still don't have the necessary ingredients. There's one city where you do have the necessary ingredients, and that's New York. Because it has the low values on the buildings, you have a lot more incentives taking place from the city, which is enabling conversions to take place, not just downtown, but now in Midtown. And also, you have some magic mountain out there in New York that's producing people who are making enough money to afford $4,000 a month rents. That's not happening in a lot of these other markets. So I'm going to conclude by just talking about what was my favorite conversion story of the year. Is about a building in Providence, Rhode Island called the Superman Building. This was probably the most iconic building in Providence. You always see it on the skyline. Every postcard of Providence has it featured prominently. A developer bought this building 10 years, no, more than 10 years ago, but then it was emptied out by its office tenant. And for 10 years, he's struggled to get this building, get a conversion plan underway. And he ran into one obstacle after another. Obstacle number one, the city and state wouldn't provide the subsidies he needed because they wanted it to remain a hub for office workers. They didn't want it to be converted to residential use. When they finally came around, provided him a subsidy package, then the interest rates spiked and the numbers no longer worked. Expenses went up, costs went up. And the sad thing is that when he finally put the whole thing together, unfortunately, he died, and that kind of put the whole project back to square one. But it was a really dynamic and somewhat tragic story of this developer struggling to convert this building. And he really loved it. One of the scenes in the story that I like a lot was he would take people into this great banking hall, and he'd go to all these ancient switches and start flipping the lights on just one by one. And you can almost hear that or see that happening. So he loved the building, but he was never able to turn it around. The interesting thing was that when we were writing this story, we wanted to contextualize it. So I started looking around throughout the country at other iconic buildings in different cities, and it was astonishing to me. Just about any major city in the country, you throw a dart at a map, and we would find that either the most iconic building or the biggest building or very prominent buildings were suffering the same problems because the office downturn really is here to stay. And a lot of them had conversion plans in mind, but very few of them are actually working because either they don't have the subsidies, or they certainly have the low values on the buildings, but they don't have the subsidies, or they don't have the market. They don't have enough people who are willing to afford the kind of rents that are necessary. And even in some places where the subsidies are available, I noticed one of the first slide you showed, that was the LaSalle Street corridor. They have subsidies there, and I think that project came out in 2022. They announced the subsidies. Very few of those projects have actually broken ground. They're very hard to pencil out. So sorry to kind of be a Debbie Downer here, but there's good news and bad news. The good news is that conversions will be here to stay. The bad news, it's really hard to make the numbers work. So with that, glasses half full, half empty advice, I turn over to the next panelist.
All right, thank you so much to the Weitzman School for inviting me to present. My name is Arpit Gupta, so I'm a professor in NYU Stern. My grandfather was actually a civil engineer, so a professor of civil engineer. So it's a little bit of a homecoming for me, I guess, in a way, to come back to the topic of architecture and building. So the basic idea I just want to get across today is the core concept of adaptive reuse is a really great way of getting fastly built, low carbon ways of adding housing in centrally located ways that also takes out a piece of this obsolete office space. And in order to kind of get there, we need all the conditions as Peter just outlined. We need the cost basis to be low, so the building has to be bought for cheap, i.e. it kind of has to be a foreclosure or forced sale or something like that. We need the financing part of it to line up. We need the geometry, the actual parameters of the building space to kind of work out, and then finally policy has to help drive things along the way. So together with some of my colleagues, Stamo Norberg and others, we have done a lot of work in the last few years to try to understand the shocks to the office market. So we had coined the phrase, actually, office apocalypse, to characterize the disruptive impact that remote and hybrid work have on demand for office buildings. And we think there are really a number of key features which make this entire sector under much greater risk today. So kind of already have mentioned this remote hybrid work factor, which is obviously lowering demand for people to come into the office. We also have the interest rate situation, which maybe now is coming down a bit, hard to tell, but has certainly been a more elevated interest rate environment in the last couple of years than we're used to. So this poses huge issues for valuation of the buildings, as well as to arrange financing. And these manifest in terms of lower values. At the same time, we all know on the housing dimension that we have high rents, we have limited supply and capacity. So it's sort of a multiple bird, one stone situation whereby we can potentially relieve the pressure on the housing market and also take out some of this excess capacity on the office market. And these two pressures are linked, because one of the reasons that housing demand has been so high in the last few years is exactly because people are working remotely a little bit more, working hybrid, and that means they want more space at home. So this is a great way to reallocate space in ways that respond to shifting household preferences. And the climate part of it is relevant here too, because the embodied carbon in these buildings, right, all of the concrete steel that goes into these structures contains carbon. It's also, by the way, very expensive to build and source raw materials, even more expensive after tariffs. So it's ideal if we can kind of keep all this structure in place, and buildings in general are really responsible for a lot of our carbon emissions. So what is converting in the marketplace today? We're seeing more, again, as Peter mentioned, sort of glass half empty, half full situation. I like to think of the glass as half full. So I would say we're seeing a lot of conversion activity in core submarkets across the country. One thing I think we are seeing is a lot of the output that's kind of coming out is sort of skewing towards studios and one bedrooms, kind of dealing with a lot of these window and daylight constraints. And really, in order to make this happen, you kind of need the dollar value of the residential square footage to be a lot higher than what you could get for rent as a B or C class office, right? And you need to be able to kind of reprice that conversion. I kind of pulled these other graphs on conversion activity. We certainly seem to be seeing some amount of increase in these conversions. At the same time, new spending on office buildings is kind of going down. So together with some of my colleagues, we had put together a piece for the Hamilton project at Brookings that tries to identify systematically where these conversion targets might be and could potentially be targeted. So this is our estimation. Obviously people can come up with their own views on where there are conversion targets, but we find a number of these all across the country. Here I'm breaking these down, New York and the rest of the country. So New York is really great for this because we have a ton of this really nice pre-World War II stock that has those kind of narrow floor plates. However, we're seeing a lot of new conversion activity enter into those kind of 70s, 80s floor plate designs too, both in New York and around the country. Another feature of this market that helps conversions pencil out is the distribution of vacancy within buildings, right? So we know what the numbers are at the market level, but vacancy within markets is really concentrated. There are a lot of buildings that basically have no vacancy. Everyone wants to be in these buildings. And there's this whole long tail of buildings that are suffering from a far greater degree of lack of occupancy. And it's going to be those buildings that are going to be ideal targets to convert, right? Because these are the buildings where the tenants are kind of already emptying out. And so we're seeing a lot more of this concentration of vacancy activity. So where does this work? We want to kind of focus on these sort of B and C class offices, the lower quality offices, so a little bit older, ideally having some sort of narrow floor plate. Even the 70s and 80s ones can work when you have these sort of cuts in the building, as we kind of just saw. So either like a center cut in the building to allow light, or kind of these side cuts along the perimeter. We also kind of emphasize in our piece thinking about the brown to green part of it, trying to identify buildings where they might be out of compliance with emissions norms in order to help green the building kind of at the same time. And so we did a kind of a count of all the units that we could sort of keep track of across the country. We sort of estimate that you could convert and produce something like 400,000 apartments this way and take out a little bit of a chunk of our office vacancy. So is that a little? Is that a lot? It's not going to solve the housing problem overnight. It's not going to solve the office problem either, but it can make a meaningful dent on these kinds of conditions. So let's talk a little bit about the financing part of it. What kind of makes these things pencil out? What sort of really works? Well, you need this acquisition cost to kind of reset, right? You need this cost basis, the purchasing price to be really low. The conversion costs now become super important. So we have sort of a baseline here of $300, $400 per gross square foot, but this is a really key input and parameter into this. And it's also one that's changing quite a lot as the cost of new construction really skyrockets, right? Due to the cost of acquiring raw materials, the hard and soft costs of construction. That's kind of to the benefit of converting these existing structures with all their building materials already in place. Of course, you've got some loss factor because you're not going to be able to make use of the interior space as efficiently as a residential building as with offices. So you have to kind of keep track of some losses, and you have to kind of lease up the building. And all these factors mean, as Peter mentioned, that some sort of abatement policy that reduces the property tax load can help with the financing part of it. Finally, one other thing that matters a lot, as we estimate, is how many of these buildings are affordable. So if you talk to policymakers and you say, well, we're going to have a conversion, it's going to generate housing, they're going to say, I don't really care unless it has affordable housing units built into it, because we have these deep structural inequities within cities, and policymakers really want to try to target affordable housing units in these new structures. So we find that how many affordable housing units you stack into your building makes a huge difference on the financing ability for this project to pencil out. So what that means is if city policymakers have that objective, they kind of need to pay for it with some amount of property tax abatement in order to get the project to pencil out. So we're seeing these policies work on some level. So New York City is kind of the best example probably of effective policy. We have a 467M conversion abatement policy that sort of follows earlier 421G policy in New York helping conversions. California has some different policies as well. So these abatement policies basically function to construct the legal environment as well as the financial incentives to allow these conversions to happen, often with some degree of affordable set-asides. So in New York City, we're looking at something like 15 million square feet of conversions, 17,000 apartments, increasingly more in Midtown and other neighborhoods in Manhattan that weren't typical conversion hubs, also facilitated by our city's rezoning plans, i.e. the City of Yes. So what we kind of see, what makes these conversions happen is really that abatement policy with some sort of predictable affordability component, as well as these by right or ministerial paths to allow conversions to happen, right? So you don't need to follow a very discretionary process to get your conversion approved if you have a pathway. In addition, other local policies like LIHTC, other types of debt policies can help make these conversions pencil out. The federal level policies, which we're once very hopeful for, seem to be a little bit less relevant these days. And finally, there's a little bit of a push to ban windowless bedrooms, which may make some of these conversions a little bit harder. So finishing up here a little bit with thinking about other drivers of how these conversions are going to work in the future. We kind of observe with remote working trends that hybrid is kind of seems to be pretty sticky right now. These trophy assets are certainly doing very well, but this B and C class stock is still pretty pressured. What that means is we basically still have this overhang of obsolescent office space that doesn't really seem to be coming back into use anytime soon. And so that reflects the best scope for conversion activity, because these return to office mandates still aren't really activating that sector of the housing stock to the extent firms are coming back. They kind of want nicer space. Furthermore, we're now seeing the arrival of AI onto this marketplace, and we're seeing a lot more firms starting to cut back. Now, are they cutting back these workers because of AI? Is AI the excuse that they're using to kind of cut back white-collar workers? It's hard to say, but the impact that has on the marketplace is there's a new source of softening and weak office demand coming online for these same properties, and and I worry that's going to impact office demand going forward. So what I'd like to see a little bit more in this space, one place where I think there's a really clear role for government to come in is by aspects of state capacity. So we looked a lot at the Netherlands, which has actually done a lot of conversion activity. So like 15% of their housing in the last 10 years comes from conversions. And they really have a very government-led process whereby these transformational teams will come to jurisdictions and help them plan how to make these conversions happen, i.e. they'll map things out, they'll find the buildings, help with the financing, and all of that helps to catalyze local municipalities in figuring out how to make these conversions actually happen. So it'd be great to try to model these kinds of tools here, have some sort of conversion accelerator program, improve our policy outreach, and try to proactively encourage building owners and financiers, et cetera, to kind of connect and kind of make these conversions happen. So just to wrap this up, it's not a panacea, as everyone always says. It's a targeted way of addressing some of the salient challenges we face in our urban markets. And I think it does have a lot of potential here to kind of stabilize the center business district, revitalize cities, and hopefully lower emissions too. Thank you all very much. Looking forward to the rest of the session.
Let's see. There we go. All right, how y'all doing? All right, try to be quick here. Vincent Reyna, faculty here at the Weitzman School. Really excited to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm the faculty director of also this thing called the Housing Initiative at Penn. We're a research lab that partners with municipalities to develop housing programs and housing solutions and evaluate them. So you're going to hear a lot of consistent themes coming across, but clearly some slight differences in some of our takes, which I think are actually quite important, right? So one of the clear opportunities, right, is converting commercial properties to residential use. And that seems like a really nice idea, right? We've heard already we have a housing supply shortage. You have to live under a rock at this point, right, to not know that. It's in the news every week, right? Numbers vary dramatically, right? These are all in millions. So anywhere from 3 million to 7.1 million housing units are needed across the country, right? So that sounds like a real nice opportunity for conversions, right? Because we can just convert everything to $4,000 apartments in New York City, and there's plenty of people making those wages to actually afford them. The reality is that there's actually a lot of nuance under this housing supply demand dynamic, and I'm going to give a couple examples here at the local level, right? So here's Maricopa County, where Phoenix is located, right? This is a graph I brought everywhere with me at the White House to make the case of some of our housing supply challenges. What you can see is in 2010, right, over 20% of the housing units in Maricopa County rented for less than $500, right? In 2010, less than 90% rented for below $1,000, right? Or rather, between 25 and 90%, so what is that, 60-something percent rented between $500 and $1,000. By 2024, right, do you see any units under 500? And where are those units between 500 and 1,000, right? That's a wholesale loss of an affordable housing unit. And what that means is our housing supply challenges are not just supply writ large, but they're often affordable supply. And you start to get the challenges, like Arpit just mentioned, about actually filling gaps along the way, right? Coming here to Philadelphia, we recently released this report, right? If you looked at the housing stock in Philadelphia, we actually have enough housing for most households. We just don't have enough housing for the very poor households, right? So households below 30% of AMI, which in Philadelphia is about households making roughly $33,000 per year, we estimate that there's a shortage of 65,000 affordable and available housing units. And that shortage is actually jamming up everyone else, right? So we don't actually need market rate units in Philadelphia. We actually have an excess of them. There's high vacancies of new luxury buildings in Philadelphia, and with the numbers coming online, there actually is potentially a legitimate concern about overbuilding at 1 and 2 bedroom market rate units in Philadelphia, right? What we do need is actual affordable units, and the numbers don't pencil out there. And that becomes a real challenge as we think about conversions generally, but particularly conversions as a panacea. So I say this with personal experience because everyone reads the New York Times, and the worst scenario was the New York Times writes an article about conversions being the solution to all of our nation's housing affordability problems. And then the president's chief of staff says, we got to do this conversion thing. What can we do, right? And we say, well, you know, it's kind of nuanced, you know, maybe it'll help a bit, maybe not totally, right? Happened with Ron Klain, then happened with Jeff Zients, right? Not a bad idea on its face and really wonderful opportunity, but not necessarily a panacea, right? That said, there's a lot we can and should do, which is an important theme of today, right? And so one of the things we did at the White House at the time, and thank you, Arpit, for alluding to a previous period of activity, promise we did not collude on that, was we came up with a whole suite of federal tools meant to try to help accelerate conversions. We didn't have all the tools, but we had some tools we could actually move forward with. We came forward with this handy guide about conversions going across the country that we're actually leveraging some of those federal tools. And I'll highlight a couple examples here. But the reality is that those federal tools were kind of a really important foundation, but at the end of the day, these conversions are inherently a function of local needs and demand, be it housing demand, be it what's going on in the real estate market and the commercial real estate market, local capacity, including what's actually zoned to happen in given areas and the ability to change those things and actually build, and a lot of political will, right? What you realize is to make conversions happen, you often need a lot of political will to overcome a lot of those other barriers and make the deals actually happen, right? So I'm actually going to refer to the LaSalle corridor revitalization. We just heard maybe not the best example, right? And by number of conversions, absolutely not the best example of a success story, right? To date, they have one groundbreaking, right? But they do have over 1,400 units in the pipeline based on their kind of projects they put forward. So I'm highlighting this because I think there's a real opportunity with conversions to think strategically and comprehensively, which is what Chicago did. They had this thing called a tax increment financing zone, right, around their downtown. And what that did is essentially leverages increases in property taxes and allows a certain zone to capture them and essentially invest in that zone, right? So in theory, investments in that zone are increasing value so they can capture that value and kind of perpetuate those investments along the way, right? So what the mayor had done in Chicago was try to essentially leverage that TIF to say, could we actually do something to revitalize our downtown corridor? They drew a strategic line around a certain number of blocks, right? And essentially put out an RFP and said, who in this zone can redevelop properties? We will consider you for direct TIF financing to actually make these deals work, right? A lot of politics around this. One of the reasons for delays is that when the mayor changes, right, does the new mayor want the old mayor's policies and programs? And there was a debate whether the current mayor would actually continue with this whole model and actually allocate TIF money towards this redevelopment, right? Because it's quite controversial. In a city with high poverty, what the city of Chicago was going to do was to allocate hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue from their business district to the business district for housing, only some of which was actually affordable, right? That said, the current mayor decided to move forward with it for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which is they did have targets around housing affordability. So the LaSalle corridor, I think, is a really interesting example of the will story, right? Because what you saw was political leadership who said these conversions are not necessarily going to happen on their own, and they're particularly not going to meet our need, which is affordable housing. So what we need to do is create financing tools and mechanisms to actually make those deals work, right? So as of now, there's one property where the actual ground broke, right? This is 79 West Monroe Street. I'm not a Chicago expert, so anyone here from Chicago, feel free to correct me about anything specific here. But essentially was taking a historic property and renovating it, and particularly renovating 7 floors to create 117 new residential units, 41 of which were going to be affordable, right? That used $28 million in TIF financing to actually make the deal happen, right? Here's another property that's actually set to break ground in theory in early 2026. Things change quickly. Who knows if that will happen, right? That said, this is another historic property that's being converted. What's really cool about this one is that there's actually 2 hotels in the property and they're putting residential space in the middle. What I really like about the LaSalle example is that a lot of these properties were only partially vacant, which is one of the commercial conversion challenges, right? Arbit talked about this already, the idea that there's ideal properties that have a certain number of vacancies that actually make it viable to actually convert the properties. With this strategic effort, what they did is they actually worked with developers to make it possible for them to make partial vacancies actually work to their favor. And to me, that's really exciting and innovative in important ways. Want to highlight another example, which is actually quite an old property here. This is in Memphis. This is the Crosstown Concourse. This was an old Sears warehouse that was closed in 1980, abandoned in 1993. What they've done is convert it to 260 apartments, 20% are affordable. It includes a high school, a YMCA, a whole bunch of commercial spaces. So this property would have never existed but for local political will to actually make it happen, right? This property leveraged a HUD Section 108 loan. What a HUD Section 108 loan is essentially cities get a certain amount of money from HUD to do community development endeavors. They spend it on nonprofits, they spend it on housing, a whole bunch of things. But what cities can also do is essentially say, I'm going to use those funds as a guarantee for a loan for a large economic development project. And if that economic development project goes bust, we're going to have to pay it with these community development funds, right? So to use a loan like that, you have to have a lot of political will and desire to actually move forward with the property, right? You have to feel like the numbers are going to pencil out. In this case, it wasn't actually clear that that was going to happen. But local elected officials said, you know what, we really want this to happen, and we're going to allow this property to leverage a 108 loan, which essentially created a catalyst for a whole bunch of other financing mechanisms to come through, right? Because the private sector essentially says at some point, if the city is all in this way, they're clearly trying to de-risk this development. And so we feel more confident actually lending to it. And this is another kind of great example of that. To go back to your Superman example, the Superman building, interestingly enough, that has been a case of endless political demise, right, as we heard partially already. Most recently was that they actually came to us when we did this commercial conversion initiative to see if they could be the first group to access what we call a TIFIA loan, which is essentially a Department of Transportation loan, normally for large transportation projects. What you do is you give low interest loans that are in the hundreds of millions of dollars for essentially infrastructure, only previously used for transit, and we had actually for the first time made it usable for housing, right? And so we had 13 projects in the pipeline for TIFIA loans, and my understanding is there's preliminary approval for a $236 million TIFIA loan. It could have been RIF, it's a similar DOT program that we worked on, for the Superman project that I'm not sure is actually going to see the light of day because of the current administration, I think has pretty much annihilated that, the ability to do that. So all to say is, in concluding my comments together, I think here we have a tremendous opportunity to think about conversion opportunities, right? I think clearly it connects to our housing supply needs, but we have to be a lot more nuanced than that, right, when we try to make that connection. And we have the ability to do that, right? It takes a lot of local will, it takes a lot of local effort. There's a challenge of scale there, right? Can you actually solve our housing supply problems with these conversions? I think no, right? But that's okay. You can still actually reimagine whole neighborhoods. You can revitalize whole neighborhoods. You can address issues of housing affordability and add a really important piece to our puzzle, to our many tools that we need to actually address our housing supply needs and community revitalization needs. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Martha Kelly. I want to thank Hina and the University of Pennsylvania for having me. I am a Philadelphian and a Penn grad, so glad to be back. I had thought that my presentation was the only one without pictures, but it wasn't, so thank you for that. I think what's been interesting so far tonight is that, you have 5 people on the stage who truly come from, different disciplines. I'm come from the finance world, but all of us are basically saying the same thing, which is that there's sort of the bull case and the bear case for, residential conversions, office to residential conversions. And at the moment, they are sort of harder to actually effectuate than it would seem on the surface. But nonetheless, there's a lot of reasons to spend time thinking about them because it's not just about the individual deal. It's about, transforming neighborhoods one by one and hopefully chipping away at the sort of housing crisis we have overall. But so my plan for today was to talk through the bull case and the bear case. You've heard a lot of these things, and so I'll go quickly through this. I'm going to talk about a case study, which is a building that I underwrote when I was at Goldman to either acquire or be the equity on, and then when we said no to that, we looked at the debt, and we said no to that. And so that's an example of basically pointing out why these deals don't pencil, right? You've heard that term a bunch, and since I'm the one with the pencil and writing the checks, like this is just an example of real life, like how an underwriting that looks good on paper, can start to really erode when you have folks like me behind a computer, really digging into the assumptions. So look, I think everyone has touched on all of these things, but at a very high level, the way I would think about, kind of the bull case for a conversion strategy would be, number one, right? It's supply at scale. It's trying to chip away at the housing crisis we have, and candidly chip away at the affordability crisis we have, because as everyone has talked about, most of these programs, come with subsidies that sort of mandate some affordability, and so you're getting both housing units and you're getting some allocation of housing units that are affordable. That is good. And generally speaking, the idea that you're taking obsolete B and C office space out of the market and replacing it with usable residential, square footage, again, like a really interesting and compelling idea. I would say, and I'm going to talk mostly about New York because all of my experience has been in New York and most of the projects that have been completed are in New York. So my lens is New York, but keep in mind there are 44 active conversions underway in New York. I think someone mentioned 15 million square feet. That's great. That's going to add 17,000 apartment units to that city. Awesome. I also, there's 500,000 apartment units needed, and so 17,000 is like 4% of, the necessary additional supply that's needed. So like keep in mind scale. I think someone mentioned scale, and that's a big concept here for me is, when we think about investing in strategies like this, that where we do think there's sort of long-term tailwinds, we do think a lot about scale and can you access scale? And in this instance, I really think because this is sort of rifle shot approach to sort of every deal is different, it is hard to sort of scale this from an investment perspective. But anyway, that obviously a positive. Policy tailwinds, you've heard a lot about all the different policies. Again, New York City has adopted some, that are really helping this. It's effectively a tax subsidy, and so it allows for a big tax abatement, and that effectively, subsidizes the pro forma. We can go into that a little bit more, but I think these are necessary as part of the solution. The green upside has also been talked about, right? Like these projects have, less embodied carbon, and so overall, sort of there's a green angle here. And the one that I think is the most interesting, again, just because I'm a real estate investor, is just this idea that this is a natural market correction. Again, you're taking undervalued real estate and replacing it with real estate that's worth more. Theoretically, that should be, adding tax revenue to a city, right? So that's great. It should also be, helpful for investors because you're trading out a lower value asset for a higher value asset. And it's just sort of a natural evolution of these real estate markets. And so, I think that's sort of very, very interesting and positive. This, by the way, like the whole idea about under pressure, this is the whole thing, right? The office market is under pressure right now because it's underoccupied and there's a lot of vacancy, and that's really putting pressure on landlords who can't raise rents. And so there's sort of a vicious cycle of downward pressure in office, which as you pull stock out of, if you pull, kind of square footage out of the stock, naturally that will ease the pressure, the downward pressure on the office market. And at the same time, if you're adding residential units to a market that has 2%, vacancy, you're easing the pressure on the other way. And theoretically, you should be, kind of like the pressure valve on both ends is going to dissipate a little bit, which to me is sort of really interesting. And candidly, like cities as organic engines that continue to sort of rebuild themselves and grow and thrive and adjust and change to natural market conditions, I think this is sort of like right on theme with that. And then there's proof points. I think these are happening. They have happened in the past. We got the history lesson. And so there have been successful projects that have been delivered. And I've walked through many of them. And they look and feel like residential projects. And, people live there. And it's great, right? And so I think that the proof points, are really important here. The quick bear case, you've heard all of this. The biggest one is that most of these office assets that we look at don't actually fit. It's really hard to retrofit an 80s building that has a huge floor plate. You need to drill light wells in the middle of it. That's expensive. Facades are often challenging. They don't have operable windows. You need to reskin the building. That's really challenging. That's expensive. The gross to net, I think someone mentioned there's about a 20% loss factor. And so, the 500,000 square foot office building becomes a 400,000 square foot residential building. That puts pressure on the math. And so, when you actually go through and look at the individual attributes of the buildings, you'll find really the ones that are convertible, viable candidates for conversion are, sort of a lot smaller. The thing that I think hasn't been touched on, because all of these things have been touched on, is the timeline. Remember that it's very, very, yes, there is 20% vacancy in New York City, but it's very rare to have a building be 100% vacant today, right? Oftentimes, office buildings are multi-tenanted with varying lease structures, start 5 to 10-year leases that are signed at different terms, they stagger, they roll, and so you don't really ever have a clean vacant building that can all of a sudden magically be converted. You have a building that's a hybrid, it will have 3 floors of vacancy, then it'll have a half a floor rented to some tenant, then it'll have 2 more floors of vacancy, then it'll have another couple floors rented. And so the actual timeline to de-lease that and get to the vacant space that you need to then convert is actually quite long. And if it's sort of lease by lease, you can buy tenants out. That's expensive. Sometimes they can't be bought out. Sometimes you can relocate them. Sometimes you can't. But just, I think oftentimes this little nuance of actually getting to a vacant building is forgotten about in this whole equation. So time is money, and the timeline just ends up getting elongated in these conversion projects. By the way, developers have done these partial conversions where you can start to convert vacant floors into residential while the office tenants are still, occupying space. It gets complicated with, how the elevator shafts work and who's accessing what space and all of this security. It has been done. It can be done. It's complicated, but it's a potential solution. I think you talked about that. All of this leads to the pro forma question, the penciling question, the math question, which I will go through, so I'm just going to skip that. And then scale, again, is when I think about, right, I'm a real estate investor who's trying to deploy large, fund at scale into real estate investment opportunities across the country. With office to residential conversion, where every single, deal is bespoke and nuanced, it's really hard to deploy at scale. And it takes a lot of time and money and investment to really just, get your engine up and running, to learn how to do it, to partner with the right folks, to get your legal docs working in the right way, to find the financing relationships that you need to be able to execute this. And if you do all of that and invest the time and money to do that, and you can only find 3 or 4 projects to go do, and each one of those takes a lot of time, the way we think about it is that, investment of time and money worth it relative to the scale of, the investment opportunity. So, but anyway, there are swing factors that would make this more or less interesting to folks like me, right? Cost of capital is probably number one. If any of you guys can magically lower interest rates, that would be great. But I think it's all about sort of additional zoning, and adjustments, anything that reduces friction, anything that reduces time. And candidly, another thing that we haven't talked about yet that we probably should is just neighborhood readiness, right? The idea that a lot of these conversions are happening in former office neighborhoods that are now becoming mixed-use neighborhoods. Yes, developers and capital can go transform a single asset, but the neighborhood needs to also transform and have services and have grocery stores and have transit and have schools. And so the more that cities can sort of help create the infrastructure around making these, neighborhoods truly live, work, play, as opposed to, kind of devoid of services, that would help. So that's the quick, bull and bear. I will walk through this fast because I think we're all running over. But this was, a deal that I underwrote. It was several years ago. This is 55 Broad Street. It has already been converted. A developer called Metroloft with their partner Silverstein, approached Goldman and many other groups to see if we would finance this project. By the way, those are both prolific developer converters right now, and high respect for them. They're great. Metroloft has been doing this for a long time. They're probably the most experienced converter of these assets in New York City. But anyway, this is an asset in downtown New York, right by the World Trade Center and Wall Street. It was an office building, 435,000 square feet. It got converted into about a 350,000 square foot residential building with about 571 residential units. So the plan was at the time, and again, this was sort of back when I underwrote it, and so the plan changed a little bit, but this was basically buy a vacant or near vacant office building for $170 million, which was around $400 a foot on the existing office that became $500 a foot, by the way, on the residential because of the loss factor. Invest another $230 million or $650 a foot to convert it. This did include terminating some office tenants that needed to go. And so all in, sort of the project was a $400 million project. It took several years to complete, and now it's done. The plan was 35 floors. I think they added one additional floor on the top, 571 units, mix of studios 1s and 2s. And this plan had no affordable, although I know after the fact they did do it with affordability in it. So here's the math I promised. So this is the actual budget that I got. And again, this could have moved around, but I can do the pointer, try to do the pointer. So a couple things that I highlighted, a lot of numbers on here. This is what I do all day long. Purchase price, as I said, it was about $500 a foot on the residential square footage. That feels to be a little bit high. And so when we talk about opportunities, this was an office building that traded for, again, $400 a foot plus or minus, became $500 a foot on the resi. That's sort of, I think, the max that someone could pay in New York City to make this math work. This was the $1 million of tenant workarounds. This is what I mean, buying out tenants, asking them to leave early, buying them out of their lease. I highlighted two, what's this? Yeah, there was a couple, two contingency numbers. So there's a big contingency here, which we like to see when we're the capital, a big contingency here. That I think this just goes to show you that experienced developers know that they're going to find a lot of stuff that they can't plan for, and therefore they're building in big contingencies. A negative $2 million VE is not something I like to see already in the budget. And what I would also highlight is financing is very expensive. I think most people know that interest rates are high. This was done a few years ago. Interest rates were high, and so just the financing cost was almost $60 million of the budget. So again, when you guys are thinking high level about there's soft costs, there's hard costs, there's the cost to buy the building, there's a huge cost to actually finance the acquisition, the purchase, and the construction, which I think people don't think about. So all in, again, this was a $400 million deal, about $1,200 a net foot, which is a number I would think about, $700,000 a unit, on the resi. So why does this math not work? This was my very rough math. So the developer is going to want to make a 30% profit, plus or minus, on this deal. So I sort of looked at that and said, okay, a $400 million deal, you're going to put a 65% loan on it, so 35% of the money is going to come from the equity, which would be me and or the developer, mostly the capital, a little bit the developer. You'll borrow money, but you're going to want to make a profit on it. And so, the developer is seeking to make, whatever, 30% profit, 20% profit, something like that. And, with several assumptions around cap rates and other things, I sort of backed into, okay, like you'd have to believe that this building could rent for $100 a foot, plus or minus, to kind of pencil. What actually, I went through the model, and it had been a while, so I was double checking myself. They were underwriting $95 rents, which is, $4,700 a month. This was sort of day zero rent. Remember that rent grows, right? You've seen like material rent growth. And so the actual sort of ending rent was closer to $5,500 by the time that the asset leased up. They were underwriting a 4.5 exit cap rate. I'm not really going to go into that because it's, but in any event, this is a multiple of basically how much revenue can you earn from this building, and you apply a multiple to it, and that's the valuation of your building. And so basically the developer thought that at the end of all of this, if they could build this project and lease it up at these rents, it would be worth, $580 million. They would make that $150 million profit, which is effectively a two times multiple, which really is what a developer would kind of seek to make on a project like this. Make a 30% return, all looked good on paper. When I, got the underwriting and started to tinker with it and say, okay, what would I have to believe, or what do I believe, and where would I have to tweak this to feel really comfortable that like this is a solid investment? I'll just point out a few things, and it doesn't take a lot to turn that 30% IRR into a 10% IRR and have this math not work. So, you take rents down by 5% to $90. You maybe take rent growth down by a tick because maybe you don't believe that rent is going to continue to grow forever. You increase the exit cap. Like at the time, a 4.5 exit cap was wildly tight relative to the cost of, relative to interest rates and where we thought cap rates were. So maybe you expand cap rates a bit. All of a sudden your valuation, magically is down by $80 million. And so that's cut your development profit in half just by doing those three things. Oh, by the way, your return has fallen to a 10%. And that's just tinkering with 2 or 3 things. That's not blowing out the budget. That's not, talking about the timeline. What if there was a 10% increase in costs? All of a sudden you're down to $40 million developer profit. If there's a 20% increase in costs, you're flat. You've made no money. I only point this out. I mean, I think it should be a debate. It is a good debate as to whether or not a developer should be making, a 2 times profit, $150 million on this deal. That's a whole nother conversation about, the real estate capital markets and all of that. This is just to say, these deals are highly, highly sensitive to some certain, few inputs, including rent, including cap rates. And it really, your view on what these numbers are really, really matters. At the time when we underwrote this was our view. This is why we passed. By the way, the postmortem, rents grew a lot faster than this 3%. So I think this number was right, but this number became 10% for a couple of years, right? You had a period of time sort of post-COVID where rents went crazy in New York. And so while this might have been right, rents today are about $120 a foot. And this cap rate number stayed higher for longer. So, net, you're somewhere probably in the middle of, candidly, what the developer thought would be the value of the building, what we thought the value of the building would be. Probably, they're kind of right in the middle. And the deal has done fine, and it's delivered, and obviously it exists today. So that's the quick, hopefully that was quick, math of it all. I will just, end with this is, I think you've heard a lot of, not negativity, but just sort of muted expectations of where this all goes. That being said, absolutely we should be spending time thinking about this. I mean, at its basic, on the surface, I think conversions, create much needed housing. They can create critically needed affordable housing. They can revitalize whole neighborhoods. They lower carbon emissions. And as I said, it's sort of a natural evolution of the built environment, which is all really good. For the students in the room, I think definitely we need some creative solutions from you all. You now understand the challenge pro forma. So how can you think about ways to, improve the pro forma? We need collaboration amongst all the different parties in the room and all the stakeholders, as evidenced by, everyone up here. All of us need to collaborate to make this work. And we need focus from you guys. So that's it. Thank you all.
Okay, so I'm an architect, so there's going to be fewer numbers and words and more pictures. So, look, I think that was a perfect ending, a segue to kind of the presentation I want to give, because I want to talk about how we as architects can kind of help this process and come up with creative solutions that are not only creative for the sake of being creative, but also help add value, right? Again, listen to those 5 presentations, well, how is my studio so busy doing conversions? They don't seem to make any sense, right? But look, I'll start, we started at Gensler, we had done a couple of conversions, but, for obvious reasons, a few years ago, this really started gaining momentum. We happened to be doing a project at 160 Water, which I had the privilege of presenting to a group. Some of you may have seen that, back in January, I came to a group here, went into a lot of depth. We had about an hour there, a lot of depth on that and a couple other projects. So I only have 10 minutes here, so I'm going to go a little bit quicker. But when we are asked by whether a building owner could be a bank who has the underlying mortgage or the note on that building somewhere in the financial stack for that building, I'll get calls saying, hey, can we start looking at this for conversion? These are the things from a physical standpoint we obviously start to look at, right? Is it in a place where people want to live, site context, building form and floor plate, obviously probably the two most important. I can't tell you how many times people have predetermined, said this is 60s, 70s office buildings, can't work. We're proving that that's not true. Look, if a project doesn't work, it's because of something in those previous presentations, something financial, right? It's not because we can't come up with a creative solution. But we as designers have to understand that. And again, not just make a design move for the sake of a design move, but actually be thinking about that. The building envelope, floor plate, all that. One thing, the thing I probably get asked a lot is like, what is the one thing that's the biggest challenge from a design standpoint? And there's no real answer to that. Every building's different. You have to kind of look at it with fresh eyes. But if I was forced to say that, it is the large deep floor plates, the lack of natural light. That is probably the single biggest thing. So I want to talk about this sort of, although every building's different, there's a bit of a toolbox of strategies we started to develop on how to make these buildings work. Inevitably, you're going to have deeper units. You have more depth to deal with. So kind of trying to figure that out in a creative way from a layout standpoint. But then there's other things that we can do. And I'm going to kind of go through each of those and give a real world example on a project that's either completed or that we're working on, where we're using one of these strategies or a combination of strategies. First one, I'm going to start with a project right here in Philadelphia. This is a project we did back in 2017, 18. Franklin Tower, it's on 16th and Race. Some of you may be familiar with it. It was the old GSK headquarters. This was a building that was completely vacant when we started. We were fortunate. We ended up reskinning the building completely. And originally, actually, the developer's idea was to keep the bottom 10 floors as office and the top 15 as residential. That ended up changing about a year into construction. We decided to pull the trigger and go full resi. But we use this diagram here of centralized amenities. If you look at, it's a traditional center core office building, right? We had actually pretty reasonable core to window depths on the sides, about 40 feet. So we were able to do nice 34-foot deep units, a 6-foot corridor. It's a little deeper on the ends here, but we had all this space in the center. Right, it's the old centralized restrooms, the things that you needed in an office building that you didn't need. So what do you do with that? So originally the plan was to do a full floor of amenities, horizontal amenities. We were going to do it at the floor in between the office and resi. But we started to say, well, what if we start to fill these central spaces with the amenities? And we started to kind of do that throughout the building. So you end up with this sort of interesting vertical spine of amenities that culminates with this rooftop pavilion, which you can actually see here. What that actually allowed our client to do, again, thinking about how to make the building, how to add value. That floor that was earmarked for amenities now became 25 more units. So instead of a 525 unit building, it's a 550 unit building. It just helped the bottom line. So again, kind of an onion. You move into that building, you kind of need a map of where all the amenities are. The spin room's on floor 23. You got to go to the gyms here. But it actually turned out it's been really successful. And again, this was before the craze of conversions really started. Another interesting one, and we actually did it on the Philly project as well, but this is a project in Baton Rouge. Again, a lot of talk about New York, and I'm going to talk about a lot of New York projects here, but it has been done elsewhere occasionally. But this is a project that we did have our Houston office. It was the tallest building in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Chase owned the building, and they ended up converting the top. Started as the top 12 floors in, but doing 14 floors, so about 2/3 of the building. They kept the base as office. And this idea of pulling the facade back to kind of help with depth. You can kind of see the areas in blue here where they actually pulled the facade back, did a new window wall, created outdoor balconies. This is one of the ones on the corner overlooking the river. This is some images of that. So this is interesting. This idea of mixed-use buildings always comes up. It's easier said than done. Sometimes you want separate lobbies for your office tenants from your resident. This one they actually did a shared lobby, and then this is a typical residential lobby. We actually did a pool on the roof of this project as well. It's always interesting in adaptive reuse too. If there's some, these had this interesting kind of pan joist structural system that we went ahead and exposed in the units. One of the benefits on conversions is the floor to floor height in a class. If you have a 12-foot floor to floor height, it's quite bad for it's B and C office, but it's quite generous for residential, right? So I think sometimes the low floor to floors is not an issue. This is the project that I presented in detail last time I was here. Again, Pearl House is what it is at 160 Water. This we were doing during the pandemic. It really became a bit of the poster child for conversions in New York City. I kind of joked that at one point I needed a part-time job giving tours of this building because every developer in the city wanted to kind of kick the tires. How'd you get this done? And it was also because it was a 1960s office building with, we had 65 feet core to window, right? And so how do you deal with that? So this concept of what we call blind shafts, again, from existing core to window, 65 feet. No one wants a 65-foot deep apartment. So we ended up, but it wasn't quite deep enough to do a legal light shaft that was open to the sky where units could go in. So we ended up carving out these 3 shafts. We call them blind shafts. Think of them as glorified mechanical shafts. They're walled off with 2-hour rated construction. We had to physically remove the floor slab. There was a lot to it. But, again, I'm looking at, we went around and looked at all these great projects on the board, anything you carve, we had to figure out a way to add it back. No developer wants to leave square footage on the table. And so we took that square footage that was pulled out of here. We infilled what was a double height mechanical floor with an extra floor. And then we did 5 new floors on top of the building. So that wasn't just from the shafts. We had other zoning deductions we could take to do that. But again, I think this is something where you have to kind of think outside the box a little bit on how to kind of not only make all the existing floors more plannable, because now we're dealing with about 45 feet depth, which is still quite deep for an apartment. But there was a ton of value in these penthouse units at the top. So it became, kind of a great case story in the city. And here are some of the images of the interiors. We're actually going to be in San Francisco in a couple weeks at the Urban Land Institute's spring meeting, where we won a ULI National Adaptive Reuse Award for this project. A little bit more, Peter, you know this project well. Peter's actually doing a story on this project. We talked about it not too long ago, but this was a project that, was a traditional kind of huge podium wedding cake building on 3rd Avenue in New York City. We went through all kinds of studies initially of converting the tower, maintaining office at the base, some other use at the base because the base was just so large. It's an interesting concept. The problem is you end up with the worst office space still being office. No one wants to lease that deep, dark office space either. So we working with our structural engineer, had this idea of carving out. And Hina, you showed that SOM 1633 Broadway, that theoretical project that they did, where they carved out. It was actually the same structural engineer who worked with them on that concept. And we talked with them about, what if we carved out? Now I have a U-shaped floor plate that plans much, much better. And in this case, rather than building up on top of the building, we build out horizontally on kind of this back bustle. The great thing about that, I don't have to raise all my elevators. It's kind of a pure usable square foot addition versus going up vertically in the tower. So we are just starting construction on this project now. Here are a couple images of it. We wanted to architecturally, of course, just try to be very clear where the new incision was and where the new addition is. So we purposely, did differentiation on the facade. So now, again, back to all the policy discussion that we're talking about, what I think New York State and New York City has done, again, another question I get asked, why is there so much more momentum in New York than there's lots of reasons to that, right? The rents we can get, the 1.4% vacancy when it comes to rental. But I think New York City and state figured out that kind of sweet spot of the right balance of incentives, zoning changes, all those things that we've been talking about all day, where other cities have struggled and are trying, the South Street corridor, great intentions. So far, not so many projects. I was just in San Francisco talking to their planning department about, the successful things we've been managed to do in New York. So right now, those 17,000 units that were mentioned have really, that's still, although it's still just nipping away, it's 4% of the need. This has all been in the last year and a half. It's actually quite a good momentum. We just ourselves are working on 7,000 of those 17,000, and we're again, historically there's been a lot of conversions in Lower Manhattan, and we are working on 160 Water is the one I just showed you. We are working on 3 others, but we're excited to see we have 5 in Midtown Manhattan, and so like I said, ton of momentum. I wanted to highlight this project in particular, if for nothing else, from its sheer scale. So this is the old headquarters of Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company. They moved to the shiny new trophy, the Bjarke Ingels building, the Spiral over near Hudson Yards, and left these buildings, which they built themselves back in the 60s. It's actually 2 buildings. It's the main tower and then a smaller one here that was built in the early 1920s. Totally different structural systems. So we're actually converting both buildings, and then we're building a new tower. We actually drove a new core through here. So this diagram kind of shows the light blue, which is existing, and the dark blue, which is all new square footage that we're adding to the building. But 1,600 units, this is going to be the largest conversion basically ever done. It's quite complex. They just had the topping out ceremony last week. So the tower structure is all topped out, and they're framing units as we speak. But it's going to be really, again, a lot of interest in this project, and extremely complex. There's also, it's hard to, can't really see it in these diagrams. There's this little notch here. There's a light well that actually drops down through to kind of help us with the planning efficiency in those buildings as well. And here's a few of the other ones. 100 Wall Street is one of those mixed-use buildings. We're actually converting the lower half of that building. We do have tenants who are there. As we talked about, some of them are moving up to the upper portion of the building. But this is a relatively small one. I think we're seeing the Metro. 3 of these projects are Metro Loft projects. They were mentioned before. They straight out, Nathan Berman straight out told me, I'm looking for projects 1 million square feet and larger. He's every developer wants to partner with them right now, but there's economies of scale there that can help with the return. But another massive one in Lower Manhattan, 111 Wall. This is a full block building where we are going to cut a true light well down the middle and drive that down. 675 Third. This is with Van Barton, the group we did Pearl House with. We just started on this project, and then this one's interesting in that 5 Times Square. This is a 25-year-old building. This is still a very. I remember this building being built, and it is right in the heart of Times Square. I get asked, who's going to want to live in Times Square? But I think there will be a market for it. I think it's going to be a really high-end and unique product. All of these projects, by the way, all these on the boards projects are taking advantage of the 467M program. So 25% of the units will be set or income restricted. I don't want to really call them affordable because they're income restricted. Which is at like 60 to 80% AMI, and that's it. So a couple quick things, to remember as designers, right? And actually, we have to sometimes educate our clients too. I showed these are 2 Gensler projects that are new construction residential. This is actually, again, here in Philly, Riverwalk. It's right across from 30th Street Station. Did that project a few years ago. You're trying to aim for efficiencies in the mid-80s when you're doing new construction. You are just simply not going to get that in conversions. And some of the developers I've had the hardest time convincing that conversions make sense are the ones that have done the most ground up. Because it's like designed by spreadsheet mentality. They see a 70-something% efficiency and say, oh, that's ridiculous. The difference is you're not building that other 30. It's a space that exists. You have to figure out a creative way to deal with that space, right? So here, we were low 70s on Pearl House, but then when we cut the light wells out and redeployed that floor area, now we're at around 80%, right? Franklin Tower, low 70s, but we ended up putting the amenities in that centralized space. So I think we have, I had a hard time getting my head around this too. As someone who was trained, we had done a lot of ground up. You have to think a little bit differently about it. I also want to point out the kind of Tetris units here, right? I would purposely not show the floor plans to people in Pearl House until I toured them through. Because once you tour through, you start to realize, oh, these are really unique units. These are great ceiling. You have these extra closets or home offices in the back. But if someone just looked at a floor plan that looked like that, there's a little bit of hesitation versus the kind of what I would argue the kind of cookie cutter approach. If I I think I might have said this when I was here last night. If I blindfolded you, Hina, and put you in a unit in Nashville, and then put you in a unit in Seattle, you wouldn't know from the inside of the unit. They're kind of, the 30-foot depth, the 20-something foot wide, your typical 7 to 750 foot one bedroom. This allows you to actually get really creative with the unit layouts and trying to maximize every square footage. So not only is it about overall floor plate efficiency, but even average unit size. Average unit size in conversions tends to be a little larger when compared to ground up. Why? Because you have that extra depth. So you just have to get creative and see if you can add value in that. And then show people what can be done in that extra space, right? This was a vignette we did for a real project where we showed we had all these kind of awkward den spaces. Well, look, here are all the different ways you could utilize that space just to try to help our clients and then their prospective buyers visualize what could be done. Facade, I think, is an important one. Another misconception is a lot of our, okay, I'm going to finish up. Our clients come in and say, I have to reskin that building. We're actually finding ways to retrofit even those old 60s and 70s curtain walls, working directly with the window wall fabricator. And then we're often getting zoning bonuses for upgrading the envelope as well as the infrastructure of the project. So these all-in-one HVAC systems, super efficient. And so we're already meeting 2030 standards for the local law in New York City, a lot of these projects by doing this. So anyway, these are the takeaways, just a summary of all the things I just said. It is possible, but you have to have the right partners. You have to have experienced developers who really know what they're doing. I think you can embrace these from a design standpoint and really help find value and make these projects work.
It's hard to follow up after listening to all these really interesting and diverse presentations, but there are a lot of common themes as well. But I think that given that we're a bit short on time, and I do want to open it up to the audience as well, I think that, Vincent, when you talked about the project, basically it was a complete picture in the Netherlands, right? Which seemed like a very unique story in terms of the government. I mean, it wasn't just about zoning and policy, and it wasn't just about people putting things together, but there was a story that is also leading to really innovative solutions. And I'm wondering if it would be interesting to just go through with your different lenses to see what in your mind, and it may not be your own project, it may not be something that you've seen, it may not be, what in your mind it leads to sort of an innovative project in terms of this commercial to residential. I mean, in a conversion, what would you use that word innovative to sort of see? Perhaps we could start with.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting. I don't know if this is really innovative, but what I've learned is the importance, and you know, I've talked about this, for us as architects and designers to kind of be at the table. It takes everyone to kind of make it work. So the innovation sometimes is just in the kind of teamwork. It's not just a design thing. It might be a unique financing mechanism or something else, because they are hard to make work. But when you're kind of all on the same page and kind of all have the same goals, I was lucky enough to be at some of the revenue working groups as they were trying to lobby the city and the state for what zoning changes we needed to do. I think it was a unique approach that having been in New York City for 30-something years, that I haven't seen too often, where you actually saw people come together. No one is debating whether there's a housing crisis in New York anymore, right? We finally moved past that, because 10 years ago there was still a debate, and now we're actually trying to figure out solutions. So I think there's just innovation in the fact that we're trying to tackle this. We certainly haven't solved it. We have a long way to go, but we made really good progress in terms of the first step.
Oh, it's on already. Great. I'd have to think a little bit more about this, but I would say one of the things that I thought was interesting about the concourse project that I highlighted was that there was a fair amount of community engagement that went on beforehand, right? And kind of understanding community needs and the way people would actually activate the space. And I think that's a really important feature as we think about conversions that might have some wonky spaces, right? And kind of unique features to it. And so I think those community engagement pieces, while hard to scale, right, when you're trying to actually do multiple conversions, it actually is time sensitive and costly as a result, I think could actually allow for more kind of interesting opportunities to arise than people realize.
So I thought one of the interesting comments, and I'm sorry, I can't remember which one of the students said this afternoon, but they brought up Soho, and that's kind of a different approach. I mean, it's not top down with developers and banks, but it's from from the bottom up, but from artists who need a place to live. And if you think about what happened in Soho, it was all artists on the cheap finding these big, huge spaces, somehow getting their hands on them, probably not legally, but they wound up getting their hands on them and did creative things with partitions and on the cheap at minimal cost. And now Soho is what what it is today. So I think with the space there, the need there, you just need creative people like the people in this room to figure it out. But I think to do it on a super, super low budget.
When I think about the most innovative projects, I mean, I don't think about it like an individual project as much as the whole district, right? Like, I think this is most powerful when a city can transform a district from being a dead office, set of 6-block radius to like an actual vibrant neighborhood. And so I do think downtown Fidei, I mean, I don't, if you had been there in the 90s, it's like cavernous and there's no light and it was a bunch of office buildings and it started to deteriorate. And now it's full of this stuff. And so any one of these buildings, 55 Broad or the Water Street one, I mean, they're all interesting and they have their unique nuances. Is any one the most interesting? Not really. I think the idea, though, that whole neighborhood has been transformed and that, that required a whole rezoning from sort of the government, that to me is like the most powerful, is when it can really be more of a neighborhood transformation as opposed to an individual building.
There's a Whole Foods there now. It's totally
Whole Foods, yeah.
it's like
exactly.
hard to imagine.
Yeah.
So one of the things I've been thinking a lot about recently is the role of large integrated developers. So I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, and so there's like one developer who had housing next to mixed use, next to commercial, and it worked for one developer because they can benefit from the mixture of uses, and they get the rents on the commercial if people live in the residential and kind of go get a coffee, etc. So the Irvine company in California built a massive city, Irvine, California. California Forever now is experimenting with something. In London, you have these like massive estates, right, that were formerly large estates that are then turned into these neighborhoods. And when you look at these types of developments, you often see that when the developer is incentivized and owns a bunch of the land, it's kind of the opposite of Vincent's point. It's more of like a maybe top-down approach, but they're encouraged to invest and create parks or natural space because they benefit from the value uplift that benefits all the other properties. So yeah, I'm curious if there's ways of expanding that model or trying to get other ways of publicly replicating that, for example, the TIF districts that Vincent also talked about.
And that's exactly what, I mean, not just looking at the building on a case-by-case basis, but Martha, you've also talked about this and we've also referred to it and we're working on it in terms of it can't just be one building. It has to connect to the neighborhood. It has to connect to industry to make an entire impact, I would say, that can catapult. I think given the audience in the room, I mean, I do want to ask, and even though you're wearing a different hat, we would like to hear that perspective of where do you see, where do you see design sort of leading, and how can it do so, right? I mean, where it's not driven just by policy and abatements and restricted by that, but where do you see architecture having agency?
I mean, I think the solutions candidly that you showed on screen around repurposing really unusable space in an apartment to be something that you could use and sort of quote unquote sell to the customer. Density is the sort of name of the game. And so any solution around additional density, I mean, you get pretty tight when you're talking about, kind of the studios 1s and 2s in the average 600 square foot bedroom, but or apartment. But I mean, creativity around density, around usability of the small space. I think sort of moving furniture, and I've seen examples of it where it's done really well, or again, what you showed on screen, like that's innovative and can make those projects, which, really are tight, as I pointed out. It can make the difference between saying, someone like me saying, okay, yeah, I can underwrite that $95 rent because, I do think that this is a better product than exists, out there.
So one thing earlier today, there was a group. One of the groups was working on the public radio station right here, right, and they built housing on top of it. And to me, that was striking because I think also there's an opportunity for designers to just like even think of functioning commercial space as adaptive reuse opportunities, right? We kind of, the city of yes in New York City is built on this fact that there's a lot of like underbuilt buildings that we could actually build above it. One of the things we had done actually at the White House was trying to think about how could we actually convert post offices into residential buildings on top of it that then become, drivers for some profit for the post office as well. So I think like designers seeing space and thinking of space differently and not just thinking about failed commercial properties as adaptive reuse opportunities, but also actually functioning commercial properties that are just underutilizing space is also in that realm, I think is another area where designers particularly are well adept to kind of push us.
Yeah, look, I think a lot of the things I hit on the presentation, I think is I think we're truly adding value and innovation, and it is design led, but again, we're always thinking about what it means to the investors, to the developer. We have to, right? But yet trying to put design forward, not just be about the numbers and X's and O's, and one thing I didn't highlight on that Pearl House project, there was a small little public pop space, that we had that was in the 1970s. They got a zoning bonus. It's like, homeless people were hanging out there. It was really, and that was a huge part. The redesign of that public space was a huge part of it, which is what was so interesting to me about looking at all these presentations, because it was about how to infuse public space. So I think, the city also realized that some of those zoning incentives were failed policies, right? The deep dark arcades, and so now we're seeing, we were the first, but now we're seeing all these things happening on Water Street, and the whole district is different, And I think that a lot of it is because of the design stuff that we put forward, and now we're seeing other projects do similar things, and now that whole strip is going to be filled with public spaces that are actually usable, that are well designed, that are well lit. So I think good design sort of is a catalyst for good design, especially when developers see that helped add value to their development.
I think what you said earlier, which is to have designers up front, right, and earlier in the process of thinking, because if you are thinking about density and the challenges of that, architects in this room can really think of new models of what that, and that's an exciting project to do, where you're not looking at units that are just stacked, but how do they aggregate in different ways to actually have a performance that can be really unique and also very effective. I think I can go on because this is obviously our wheelhouse and something that we're particularly interested in. But I think I'll just open it up to the audience to see if there are any questions here that we can answer before we move on. Yes? Yep.
Hi. I was thinking, throughout everyone's presentation, if anything about what you said would change if you were working with a nonprofit developer. So like, for example, from a design perspective, having units that have 3 bedrooms, or from a policy perspective, doing something that is more, policies aimed specific to nonprofit developers, or from the pro forma, if there's something different that you look at when partnering with a nonprofit developer.
Well, I could talk a little bit. These guys will know more better than me. Truly affordable housing is really financed completely differently than a lot of the stuff that we're showing, which is still market rate. Yes, there's a affordability component because because of the tax incentive, but it's not really truly affordable housing, publicly subsidized housing. To me, that's another challenge, right? I have concerns about the fact that the 17,000 units that are happening are very much studios, one bedrooms, built for young professionals, and not enough family size units, not enough larger units and truly affordable. I don't think we've solved that yet, honestly. I think that's why this is just like kind of a first step, that I think we have to focus on policy that addresses just what you're asking, which is actually one of the things that's so fascinating about the mayoral race in New York City right now, right? I think Mondani's going to win this race, so everything's looking like that, and so what he's campaigning on is providing more truly affordable housing. How he ends up doing that, I think, is the big question that all of our clients have, and that we have as well.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Excellent work. Some of the floor plans that we saw today had windows or had bedrooms without windows in them. I believe New York has a requirement for windows in bedrooms. I know Austin moved in that direction. I guess, is there an exemption for these projects, or how does that work?
There's not. A lot of IBC-based codes like Philly, allow inboard bedrooms. You need some borrowed light, but as you guys know, but New York City doesn't. You're right. So what we have is a lot of studios with home offices in New York City. Now, once people move in, can you really police how they're going to use that space? Not necessarily. So it's I think the city sort of knows, how. But when we file them legally, like we have to treat them as home offices. We can't put closets in them. We can't put bathrooms directly off of them because that's a little too obvious that that's going to be used as a bedroom, right? But yeah, that's something that I think the real estate community lobbied for when they were going through policy changes, was to get that changed, but they were unsuccessful. So we can't call them bedrooms.
Yeah, just a quick note on this, because I've seen some surveys on this. So, it turns out one of the big use cases for these windowless bedrooms is families with young kids. So, like, I have a young kid, so it's actually kind of nice to not have a window for like a very young person.
Yes, maybe one more question. Yeah, go ahead, Lee.
Okay. You mentioned, thank you all so much for your very thorough and thoughtful talk. One thing that you've mentioned a couple of times in the panel and also in your presentations is the use of non-residential programs to help make these projects more feasible, be it using the amenities for the windowless spaces or having a developer oversee not just a single building, but an entire district, so that you start to get the benefits financially as the developer for adding public amenities, public spaces, kind of non-rent generating spaces. Are there other places where you've seen projects use not just renting commercial spaces or amenities, but other additional programs inside of, other strategies inside of these residential projects?
Well, this doesn't exactly answer your question, but one thing that I think didn't come up enough was the fact that these conversion projects take a lot shorter time than ground-up development, and that has a big impact on the cost. We were talking about Silverstein, the former head of Silverstein, a guy named Marty Berger, started his own firm, is now doing a project Midtown South, taking advantage of some of the new zoning there. And I talked to him about it. He's amazed at how short a time it is from the time he closed on the deal, the time he's actually going to bring units to market, and that's going to have an impact on the cost. Although when it comes to design, he ain't doing much.
I'll just add one thing here that I don't think actually answers your question, but I think is important. Like, what's interesting about something like a TIF district, right, is it allows like developers to see the benefits of more public investments, because the return on values essentially accrues to them, because they're kind of capturing all of the value and the tax money associated within that district. So there are some mechanisms too for like incentivizing firms to kind of be able to realize the benefits of investments that otherwise maybe would have been washed out, right? Because the kind of true value of it kind of gets spread out across the city.
This also doesn't exactly answer your question because it's talking about commercial
Three
footage.
non-answers.
Three non-answers. There's no good answer to your question. But I mean, I think we haven't talked about it, but because I think it's obvious. But I mean, ground floor retail is typically the highest and best use for that ground floor space. And so again, talking about the creation of an actual district that services the people who are now living in the 500 units above it is obviously having a programming that allows for ground floor retail to bring in a Whole Foods, to bring in services and daycares and just amenities and services that folks need in any neighborhood. And obviously from I don't know if this is obvious, but from a pro forma perspective, you can charge rent on that space to a retail tenant. It's worth more to them than it is to a renter who doesn't want to live on the ground floor. So that's a solve.
I think until we see more incentives to do that, it's going to be, it's hard to do it. It's hard to ask developers just on their own goodwill, let's do something for the public good, right? But if they get something for it, if they get a zoning bonus or a density bonus, I think they're more than willing to do that, because I think they also realize that it's going to add value to the overall neighborhood. And, these are things that neighborhoods, thriving neighborhoods need. So I can't think of too many great examples, but I do think that that's kind of a logical next step in terms of how we continue to try to help catalyze these and have more of them happen.
I mean, because that's a win-win, right? I mean, there's a win for the city there, that if you have empty buildings that are just no one is able to afford in terms of the commercial rent, then that has an impact on the security of the whole neighborhood that goes down, and that becomes a really big city issue, right, in terms of safety. So it's a win-win in terms of these kind of projects, beginning to think of it from a neighborhood perspective, from a public perspective. You're able to then allow safety into a neighborhood, which is for the government a win, and then for the individual it's a win, because you have more housing that is then available, right? And then of course so on a lot of these levels, these kind of proposals where you do think holistically, where it's not just on a unit basis, but on a neighborhood basis, there's a lot of value in terms of for the individual, for the city, and then of course for the building itself. So I think that's there. Now, that being said, I'll do maybe one more question if there is. Otherwise, we can adjourn. Yes? Yes. Okay, one more. You're the last question.
So with we used New York as an example, with one that likely being the next mayor and pushing for an increase in affordable housing and some of the methods that it uses to do it. Do you think that this is a sort of replicable manner of producing affordable housing, or is it going to be kind of a methodology of doing so that is dependent on the extreme capital of New York itself and couldn't be reproduced in Phoenix or Houston or any other city around the world?
I don't think we can make it replicable until we do it in New York City. Right? I mean, I think that's the biggest concern that my clients have about Donnie, right? Like, because it sounds great, but like, how are you going to do it, right? He's got, say what you will about our current mayor, Mayor Adams, but the people he had focused on housing are really smart, really, and really have moved the needle. I think more has been done from a housing front the last few years, I would argue, than we've seen in quite a while. But now we've got to check that box on affordable housing, and so look, just bringing more supply on is hopefully going to help. But I want to. We're all anxious to see how these policies get implemented before we can say whether it's going to be replicable in other cities, because it's easy to say it, it's harder to do it. That's just the reality. So.
And I mean, I just add, so our current housing affordability crisis is well over a decade in the making, right? If you look at post 2008 financial crisis, the like actual production of housing units just plummeted, right, and remained below demand, and you saw bidding up of prices along the way, right? And sadly, to a point you actually made earlier, right, 10 years ago, not everyone would have said there was a housing crisis, right? But all the numbers could show that this mismatch was happening and perpetuating, right? And there were real market failures that were essentially not being addressed by the market, right? Which is the role of government to step in. Unfortunately, government doesn't step in often until there's a crisis, because then there's political will to actually address the crisis. But that's often the hardest time to actually address the crisis, right? So in the case of New York City, right, I think there's a lot to be determined about when Mandami like actually is going to do, right? I think he's said some broad stroke things, but I think he's actually decidedly not been too explicit about how he's going to address it. But the idea of explicitly leaning in with affordability being an actual like upfront starting point, I think is an absolutely essential part of actually addressing the current affordability issues in cities like that. I'll just say though, the affordability challenges in Philadelphia are structurally different than those in New York, right? And so therefore, when we talk about replicability, there's a lot of things we could learn. But you know, here we have a dwindling housing stock that's just really old and falling apart, right? If we rehabbed all our existing housing, we would be able to address our housing needs here, right? That's a much different thing than just ground up supply for everything, right? Those things aren't mutually exclusive, but all to say is I think, you know, it'll be interesting to see what happens there, but also it's always not totally fair to apply kind of lessons from New York. I say this as a former New Yorker, I grew up in Brooklyn, right, to the rest of the country, because the market there is just structurally different.
I'll just add one thing on nebulous policy. As a person who provides capital, like we can underwrite anything as long as it's clear. So the more clear the law, the more clear the requirements, what is required from an affordability perspective, what percent of AMI, what subsidy is coming with that, that's all underwritable. What becomes really difficult is when you have periods of time where there's uncertainty in how those laws are going to play out, and an unpredictability of where rents are going to be capped and all of that. That's what really challenges the market from the perspective of someone like me. It's not that someone like me doesn't want to be putting affordable housing in projects. That's totally not true. It's all about how clear is the law, and is it underwritable? And then it's just a math question. So I think the clearer the better from my perspective.
That's a good spot to that there isn't that suddenly we'll see no development, right? Given the kind of new incentive or goals that might be in place, but that there are ways that one can begin to think about looking at that very, very important question, which it is, key to, I think, the thriving of cities going forward, and one that we can't live without. So with that, I think I'll adjourn with the panel. Let's give a round of applause for all our guests.